Hey everybody, welcome back to Leosophy. This is really the second episode in the Jungian symbols series, but it feels kind of like the first because the other one was really more a primer, uh, that just a longer version of one. But this is still episode two, um, and I think the best place to start when we're discussing Jungian symbology would be the psyche itself. Just as with Freud, who Jung was a student of for a long time and a peer up until there was a huge rift, and it's it's almost like a schism in a church because you can't prove a lot of aspects of psychology. I've discussed that in my pseudoscience series. So how do we verify which of the two is correct? Well, there's not any hard evidence to do that because we're dealing with abstract concepts. That being said, I personally identify a lot more with Jungian psychology, and I'm seeing him being sort of vindicated. A lot of people really support this now. I'm seeing more and more movement away from Freud and more towards Jung. But a lot of people are more familiar with Freud because that was the norm for such a long time. So we're aware, or most people are aware, and I'll just give a little gloss over for those who aren't. Freud had divided the human psyche into three portions: the id, the ego, and the super ego. So the id was just sort of the bundle of instincts, sort of like the reptile brain. It's the part that's responsible for keeping a person alive. And then the ego is more of what we would consider to be the conscious self, the part of you that you most identify with, the cognitive portion. And then, of course, the superego is the elevated aspect of humanity, their ideals, the things that deal with more. I don't want to use the word abstract too much, but the more abstract aspects of the human identity. In some ways, you could think of it, and this is me being very derivative here, but you could sort of think of it as the id is like the reptile brain, the ego is like the monkey brain, and the superego is like the human brain, which it's kind of funny to say that we would identify more with the monkey brain. But if you think about your daily decision making and things that sort of define you, they're really not so much based on the ideals. They really are more mammalian and less human. And I realize that sounds contradictory since humans are mammals, but that's my perspective on the matter. Well, Jung had a similar view. And so before we delve into archetypes or anything else, I think it's important to cover the three aspects for Jung. And like Freud, the center of a person's like field of consciousness, basic identity was the ego. So that's something that we don't see a huge disparity between the two. His view, and I think this is part of why so many people are more inclined to deal with, or more inclined rather to embrace Jung, is that it is less nihilistic, it is less cynical in its approach. It doesn't diminish a person. It's less monkey brain, in other words. Um, so and we'll cover this more when I talk about archetypes. But for him, the self archetype is directly related to the ego. So self, if you think about it, how you view what you are and who you are, it's in relation to other people and it's in relation to other traits. You can't identify yourself if you don't have anything to compare it to. I mean, imagine a little cabin floating in the void of space. Well, where is it? Like, how do you get there? You wouldn't know because there has to be other things. There has to be other markers, roads that lead to it, a mountain, something. But if it's just in a void, then where is it? Similarly, what a person identifies as their self can't exist independently of anything that you would draw comparison to. So, like other people, other cultures, other languages, and so forth. Even other abstract ideals. Different people have different heroes, in other words. So that's where this idea of self sort of forms. Imagine like a bubble forming upwards in a body of water. It's very organic, and it exists within the water and separate from the water, but it couldn't exist without it. The minute that bubble reaches a surface, it's going to just become united with the air, because that's all it really is. It's just air in water. Well, similarly, what we view as self exists explicitly within the realm of at the risk of sounding like I've been watching the Joker too much, a society. Gosh, it's so weird how that word was so normal and now it feels weird saying it. Um, so yeah, without a tribe or a family or a society or a pantheon, how would you identify yourself? How would you know that you are you, other than the fact that you're experiencing the world from your body? That's sort of a little Cliff's Notes version of this self from a Jungian perspective. And one of the terms that you hear a lot in Jungian psychology is individuation. And this is sort of, I don't want to, cobbling together these different facets of how we perceive ourselves into a single uniform identity. That is subject to change to some degree. People change over time, but you still have a cohesive view. In other words, think about how different you are from when you were a child, and yet you still identify yourself as the same being despite changes. And part of that is because there are fundamental things that have remained the same, other than, of course, as I mentioned before, the fact that you just happen to inhabit the same body, which even that is sort of a fallacy, because you started out as a single cell, and that cell is now dead. You are a series of copies, and you are constantly replacing your body. That being said, we can get into the whole concept of selflessness from there, but it's not a very Jungian notion, so I'll omit that for now. Now, I think the single most important thing about this video, in terms of explaining Jungian perspectives and symbols, is where it really diverges from Freudianism, is that for Freud, the self and the ego are one and the same. As I mentioned before, they start off the same for Jung, but then they diverge. They are different. They're not the same thing. Self sort of emerges from ego. It stems from ego. And they turn into two separate things. And there's a unity between the two, but they are different. And some people call this the two-center hypothesis. So ego is the center of consciousness, but self is the center of personality. It's the center of what makes you you. So self is who you are and what you are, whereas ego is more how you perceive what you are and how you perceive what you aren't, if that makes any sense. I hope I'm making sense. And the way that self emerges is from very important differentiation events, things that happen that really define you. And that's something that we don't see just in Jungianism. That's something we see everywhere. A great example of this would be if you look at every culture, and I'm talking every culture, especially for men. Often there's one for women as well, but there are rites of passage. There's something that makes you not a child anymore. And that's a good way, I think, of looking at it, is if you think about ego and self with regards to a child, they're very similar. They're almost indistinguishable, because a child's still figuring out who they are and what they are in relation to society. They're finding out what they're good at. They're finding out what they enjoy, and so forth. And, of course, everyone experiences that throughout life. But at some point, there's an official line drawn in the sand where it's, especially because you have to be valuable to your tribe, to your people. You have to say, all right, I'm no longer a child. I'm this. I'm me. And so what ends up happening is there's a rite of passage, especially with men. This sort of indicates some act where you show valor or courage, because, again, a man's role in a tribal society is protecting people. It's keeping the group safe, right? So this rite of passage takes place, and if you pass that, then you are officially no longer a child, but a man. So at that moment, you have an identity beyond just a person. You're not just a lump of clay. You have something. You're the village blacksmith, or you're the village butcher, or you're a warrior, which is what we see in more tribal societies. Usually there's a warrior caste and sometimes a shaman and so forth. But generally speaking, you now have a role to fulfill. So at that moment, you really have sort of a crystallization, a separation between ego, consciousness, the way you just perceive things, and self, who you are in relation to other things, who you are in relation to your own ideals. I got real blurry all of a sudden. What's going on here? Hang on just a second. I think it was just the lighting. It's like super snowy and cloudy here, just for the record. Um, so, what other aspects of a person's psyche is there in Jungian society? Well, I think the next episode I'll get more into the shadow and the persona. Right now, it's really more about differentiating the ego and the self. And also, one other thing, and we'll get into this probably more like episode 4, is the outer world making up a person just as much as their own inner world. And that's the most unique aspect of Jung, as well as a vital part of understanding his symbology is the collective unconsciousness. It's this idea that the thoughts and ideas that we have don't just come from within, but also come from without, from people in general. There's a united component to it, and it's very difficult to talk about without delving into a more spiritual angle, because unlike Freud's perspective, which was a lot more sanitized and a lot more, let's be fair, a lot more in sync with the scientific method, which is kind of ironic considering psychology is still technically a pseudoscience. And I made a whole video about that, but and not in a pejorative sense. But Jung's idea, it's a lot harder. You can absolutely view it through a completely sanitized and secular lens. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that when you really delve into the collective unconscious and try to grasp what it means in relation to a person and where it comes from, it is difficult to view it purely as metaphorical or purely as the result of cultural input that we take in through socialization, another important part of Jungianism, but rather it's something that exists without direct human interface. It's something that happens on a level that is well beyond the humanistic view, if that makes sense. But yeah, next time I will be going into the shadow and the persona. Like, share, subscribe, keep asking questions. Bye.